Chapter 8. I rammed it. We were on the 474 connector headed toward 155 South, which would intersect with 55 South and take us to Springfield, Illinois, land of Abraham Lincoln. Mrs. Gladstone shifted uncomfortably in the back. That store makes me want to lose my lunch. Her cane whacked the door. How long do you think it's going to take before our customers figure out our quality is slipping? I don't know, Mrs. Gladstone. Not too long, I can assure you. Another whack. My son is pushing me out. I shifted. I didn't know that, ma'am. Now you do. It didn't surprise me, though. Murray called Eldon the vice president in charge of tact at Gladstone Shoes. He said Eldon didn't have a shoe person's heart. All he cared about was money, not soul. He's decided I'm too old and he's taken over the business. I looked at Mrs. Gladstone in the rearview mirror. Eldon might be a bum, but he was right about one thing. She was old. He says I should relax, enjoy life, get a condo in Florida. She winks. You don't want to retire? Somewhere long ago in this country, it was determined that after 65, a person's brain is no longer capable of making business decisions. I think that is rot. I have more business ability at 73 than I had at 63, and I resent the implication that I am over the hill and can no longer oversee the company my husband and I built from scratch. I was about to say, oh, but didn't get the chance. A speeding truck was tailgating me, coming up close and personal to the back fender. Getting so close, I could see the fire of delight in the truck driver's eyes as he blared his horn at me an inch closer. For heaven's sake, let that bully by, Mrs. Gladstone shouted. I swerved to the right lane, screeched onto the shoulder as the truck rumbled by shaking the pavement. Stop the car! I did. Mrs. Gladstone was quiet for a long time. Take off your shoe, she said finally. What? Hand me your shoe. This was distinctly weird. I took off my right shoe, handed it to her, hoping it didn't stink. She examined the stacked heel, pulled gently at the sides, felt the cushioning inside. This, she declared, is a well-made shoe. Not too much pull on the leather, fine stitching, good sole. No plastic, I said. Ah, yes, plastic. Mrs. Gladstone's ancient face got tight. My son is quite taken with that. I looked down at my bare foot. I've noticed. Do you know what built Gladstone's shoes, Jenna? I gripped the steering wheel. There were several ways to go here. Sweat, honesty, good old American know-how. She raised my shoe in the air. An unmovable insistence on quality and fair pricing. An insistence on the finest, most shoe-educated sales force in the business. I nodded, remembering my 1-week training course where I had to remember everything that could possibly go wrong with a shoe fitting. I learned how many bones there were in the human foot, 26, including 19 muscles, 33 joints, and 107 ligaments. I learned that bones of the feet make up approximately 1/4 of all the bones in the body, that the feet are one of the most frequently injured parts of the body. I understand that the average individual will walk about 115,000 miles in their lifetime, which is more than 4 times the Earth's circumference, and came to the rapid conclusion that selling well-made, comfortable shoes is a noble profession, providing immeasurable benefit for people the world over. Then I got my own personal shoehorn, and after my 1-year anniversary, I got a shoehorn with my initials. Eldon has canceled the training courses for new employees, she said. He just fired 2 of my top store managers who refused to sell his shoddy merchandise. One of them ran the Peoria store. Her lips went tight. I got nervous for Murray. Can he do that? He has done it. But why? Mrs. Gladstone was staring at my shoe like it was a dead pet. I don't think I want to be around to witness what Eldon will do to my business. Boy, Mrs. Gladstone's, that's pretty rough. It's a sad day, Jenna, when profits and greed alone influence quality. It's an even sadder day when honor in business is close to becoming a thing of the past. The Cadillac purred across the highway, which is what you expect from a 32-valve, 300-horsepower V8 engine. Mrs. Gladstone was stirring around in the back, rattling papers, keeping busy to manage the hurt. She seemed to trust I'd get her to Springfield, and I would. Good, loyal Jenna. Loyal like a dog. A person you can count on. Just give her a milk bone and she'll go out of her way to help. I turned south onto 55. In an hour, we beat in Springfield. I was getting the hang of maneuvering this big white moose after 184 miles. There's something about holding onto a steering wheel and feeling the miles drift away from you as you push farther and farther away from what you once knew. One of the last things Mom said to me before we left the house was that even though I'd be driving a long way from home, I wouldn't be driving away from my problems. I knew this was true the way I knew that clouds weren't made of cotton. But sometimes those white clumpy clouds hanging in a gray blue sky made me wonder if God hadn't stuck some cotton balls up there when the scientists weren't looking. I knew one thing for sure. I was glad to be away from the mess with Dad. I didn't miss it one bit. I let a hot red Mustang convertible pass me, catching the license plate as the car whizzed by. It soared. I sighed. Someday. There was good news and bad news in Springfield, Illinois. The good news was that we got there. The bad news was that the hotel was overbooked with the McCoy Electronics annual sales meeting and we had to share a room. This, said Mrs. Gladstone to the bellman, is not a room. It is a closet. The bellman, who was old and deaf, said he was glad we liked it and hoped we had a nice day. He tottered out, waving happily. I checked out the room. One twin bed, one rollaway bed, approximately 5 feet in length, for all 5 feet 11 inches of me. Mrs. Gladstone lowered herself slowly onto the real bed. Gee, Mrs. Gladstone, it isn't so bad. You should have seen the room my mother and sister and I shared last summer in the Dells. Bugs in the mattress, seedy furniture. We're talking les miserables, but you know, we had an okay time. Mrs. Gladstone glared at the Springfield, Illinois visitor's guide, the city Lincoln loved, and said absolutely nothing. The hotel restaurant, El Pollo Loco, was packed with electronic salespeople who were discussing their products loudly while pouring margaritas from pitchers into huge glasses that were big enough to raise goldfish in. There could have been goldfish in them, actually, but I don't think the McCoy Electronic sales force would have noticed. I knew about margaritas because my father went through a Latin American drinking phase and made margaritas at home. He did this while singing La Bamba. He'd sing the la 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 bamba part extra high and squeeze the lime around the glass and sprinkle on plenty of salt and pour the liquor combination into the blender. Dad was very exact when he made drinks, even when he was bombed. He always reminded me of a pharmacist, measuring just the right amount of cough syrup into the bottle. Of course, unlike a pharmacist, toward the end of the evening, Dad would be measuring his concoctions on the floor. Mrs. Gladstone chewed her jalapenos without breaking a sweat. For an old person, she has grit. 3 McCoy employees began an enchilada eating contest. Not a pretty sight, but she wasn't paying attention. Her eyes got far away. I grew up along the Guadalupe River, Mrs. Gladstone said quietly, gazing out the window. I just lived to be in the water when I was a girl. Couldn't stand wearing shoes. I'd kick them off every chance I'd get and stick my feet in the water, summer and winter. And now I own 176 shoe stores. She laughed. The good Lord knows how my father would split his spleen laughing at that. He was always barking at me to put on my shoes. Madeline Jean, he'd say, you put on your shoes of peace, girl. Daddy was a Baptist minister and turned everything into a sermon. Those aren't just shoes you're putting on, he'd shout. Those are the sandals of God Almighty. I looked at her from the corner of my eye. Some people are hard to imagine as children. Mrs. Gladstone leaned back in the wooden chair, lost in thought. Daddy always said that shoes take us along life's pathways. They get all muddied up, all scratched from wear. We've got to clean them up, take care of them. He said God was like a master cobbler, stretching a piece of leather over a wooden last, fastening it down with nails, carefully stitching it together to form something special. That man had 3 sermons about shoes. I never thought about shoes that way. PKs get their share of sermonizing. PKs? Preacher's kids. I smiled. He didn't know about your business? He died right before Floyd and I opened the first store in Dallas. He would have baptized that whole place if he had the chance. That would have been something, Mrs. Gladstone. The man who won the enchilada eating contest lunged toward the bathroom door marked Hombres. The bill came. Mrs. Gladstone got out her wallet. I still feel like he's with me in every store Floyd and I open. When I was a child, I'd wondered why in the world did I have a father so all-fired fixated on shoes. She opened her hands, grinning. Sure made me think about selling them a little different. I looked down. I always wondered why I had a father who was a drunk. I haven't figured that one out yet. Curling up on the rollaway bed made me think about laying my father out on the living room couch when he was drunk. The couch wasn't long enough for Dad. He was 6'4", so I'd bend his knees to get him to fit. Faith never had to do it. Dad always said there was a price to pay for being the oldest. You're the one who gets practiced on. His dad would beat him to a pulp over something small while his younger brother Billy got the world handed to him on a Wedgwood plate. Billy was never as good as a salesman as Dad, though. My best memories of my dad were when he'd take me out to study salespeople. Dad said you can learn anything by watching other people do it. And if they do it badly, you learn what not to do. The worst salesperson we ever saw sold washers and dryers. He'd sweat and slap the machines and yell that he was giving people a price so low his manager was going to hang him. One customer stormed off grumbling, "I'll get the rope." The best salesperson sold Singer sewing machines. She liked people, liked her product, and didn't need to push anyone into buying anything they didn't want. Dad said she knew the secret. When we got home, I'd practice selling to Dad whatever we saw that day. And except when I was pitching Swampland in Florida, he always bought. Afterwards, he'd celebrate what a good little salesperson I was by having a few drinks. But before the booze got hold of him, he was a real father. Mrs. Gladstone's snoring was sounding like an approaching Amtrak train rumbling into Union Station. She was tossing, kicking off her sheets. "No!" she shouted in her sleep, then bolted up with a cry. I turned on the light. She was shaking. "Mrs. Gladstone, you were dreaming." She nodded and covered her face with her hands. "Do you want to talk about it? My mom says talking about bad dreams can make them better." She shook her old head. "I know about nightmares," I assured her. She looked straight up at me. "Yes, I suppose you do." I sat down on the side of her bed. I used to have one where I was taking a shower and instead of water coming out, it was bourbon, which is my dad's favorite drink. And I kept trying to turn off the flow, but the bourbon was washing over me and getting in my hair and eyes and mouth. I kept trying to spit it out, but I couldn't, and it tasted awful, and I was so afraid I was going to get drunk. It wasn't going down the drain either, just filling up the tub, rising higher in the room until it was over my shoulders, and I was sure I was going to drown in it. I woke up screaming. Mrs. Gladstone nodded a little. "And did I wake up screaming?" "Kind of. Well, actually, yes." She looked down, rubbed her sad eyes, and looked for her glasses. I took them off the nightstand, handed them to her. She put them on fast to cover the tears that were starting. "My son," she began, clenching her mouth to keep control, "has been buying up Gladstone stock to gain control of the business because he was afraid I would not go quietly." I didn't know much about stocks. My grandma had given Faith and me both 3 shares of stock in her boyfriend Earl's fire alarm company so we could learn the lessons of big business. In 13 months, we watched the stock go from $15 a share to nada, and Earl go from CEO to the unemployment line, so the stock market didn't hold much magic for me. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Gladstone. I don't understand." She grabbed a pad and pencil by the bedside table. "You understand what a share of stock is? It's like buying a tiny fraction of a company." "That's right. A share of stock is like a deed to a small piece of company." Now, in the case of Gladstone Shoes, there are 4 million public shares available out of a possible 12 million. Those who own the most shares own the most of the company. The problem arises when an individual or group of investors decide they want more say in a company. So they start buying more stock to get control? Precisely. And they can do that? They can. You mean anyone could take over any company they wanted if they had enough money? I shuddered. Theoretically, the system has many checks and balances built in to safeguard certain practices, but companies are taking over regularly. But what if the owners don't want to give them up? Well, that's the rub. It doesn't much matter. But that's not fair. That's like stealing. Yes, it is. Eldon and Ken Woldman, the president of Shoe Warehouse, are buying up Gladstone stock to gain control. The Shoe Warehouse was a big chain of budget price shoe stores. But the Shoe Warehouse can't own Gladstone's. They'd change it. That seems to be their plan, she said heavily. I put my hand on Mrs. Gladstone's bony shoulder. She tensed. I decided not to say that Eldon was an all-time stinking shoe louse. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat next to her like I did with my grandmother, letting her know I was there. Quality first, I always told him, Mrs. Gladstone said, this softly, shifting the weight from her bad hip. From the time he was a little boy, I would say, Eldon, there is no substitute for quality in business. When you cut corners, you lose. The customer loses. Offer the best quality and services at the best price, and the result will be profits. She stabbed her fingers in the air, holding back tears. This is what Gladstone's has been built on. I keep hoping he'll see the light. She shook her old head. I keep telling myself this isn't happening. She shifted her hip and looked out the window. For a minute, she seemed like my grandmother. I understood about being rejected by someone you love. The carelessness of it, the pain. Eldon was careless. So was my dad. You want so much to believe they'll change and love you like you need them to. You'll lie to yourself about them, make them more than they are. Mrs. Gladstone, there's got to be something you can do. It's a young person's game now. You're giving up? She looked down. I'm moving aside. But what about quality? What about the Gladstone name? Floyd took care of those things, Jenna. I kept the books, oversaw the store expansion. I put my face close to hers so she had to look at me. Mrs. Gladstone, I can't believe you're not going to do anything. Her gray eyes burned with hurt and anger. She lay back down, covered herself with a blanket, and that was that.